There are moments in Hollywood when the silence speaks louder than any confession. For decades, Diane Keaton was known as independent, witty, untouchable, a woman who never needed anyone to complete her story. But at 79, something finally cracked. What she revealed wasn't about fame, awards, or regret in the abstract. It was about one man, one choice, and a love that never found its ending. This is not a fairy tale. This is the confession she carried quietly for nearly half a century. A love that began before the world was watching. Their story did not begin with headlines or romance rumors. It began in a quiet, uncertain moment on a film set where neither of them yet understood the weight their lives would carry. In the early 1970s, Diane Keaton was still finding her footing in Hollywood. She was sharp, unconventional, and openly resistant to the idea that success required submission to men, to studios, or to expectations. Al Pacino, by contrast, arrived with a different kind of intensity. He was withdrawn, deeply private, and shaped by a childhood defined by absence, instability, and survival, rather than affection. They met while working on a film that would later be seen as untouchable cinema. At the time, it was just another risky project. Pacino was not a star yet, and in fact his position was far from secure. Studio executives openly doubted him. There were internal discussions about replacing him. Keaton remembered those moments clearly years later. The tension, the insecurity, the quiet pressure pressing down on him while the world assumed confidence. That vulnerability mattered. It mattered because Diane did not fall in love with a myth. She fell in love with a man who was being questioned, criticized, and nearly erased before he had a chance to exist. Their connection did not announce itself loudly. It unfolded in fragments, conversations between takes, shared silences, long walks where neither tried to impress the other. Diane later described feeling drawn to him not because he was charming in a conventional sense, but because he seemed emotionally unguarded in a way few men were. There was something unfinished about him, something searching. She recognized it instinctively. This was not a fling built on proximity. It was the beginning of a bond rooted in recognition. Two people shaped by very different childhoods, yet equally haunted. And from the start, that imbalance mattered. Diane wanted grounding. Pacino had learned to survive by never standing still. This difference would not destroy them immediately, but it would quietly define everything that followed. Two childhoods, one emotional collision. To understand why this love could never find stability, you have to understand where both of them came from, not as stars, but as children shaped long before fame ever arrived. Diane Keaton grew up in Los Angeles in a household defined by restraint and expectation. Her father was a civil engineer, practical and emotionally reserved. Her mother, once a beauty pageant winner, had set aside her own ambitions to become a full-time wife and mother. Diane watched this sacrifice closely. She admired her mother, but she also absorbed a quiet fear that love, for women, often came at the cost of identity. From a young age, Diane made an unspoken vow that she would never disappear into someone else's life. Independence wasn't just a preference for her. It was protection. Yet beneath that independence lived a contradiction. Diane wanted love deeply, not romance in fragments, not admiration from a distance, but permanence. She wanted to build something that stayed. The stronger she appeared to the world, the more she longed privately for emotional security. This tension defined her adult relationships. She could stand alone, but she didn't want to forever. Al Pacino's beginnings were far less structured. His father left when he was still a toddler. His mother raised him alone in a cramped Bronx apartment, scraping together work wherever she could. Stability was never promised. Attachment, when it existed, felt temporary. From an early age, Pacino learned that relying on people carried risk. Loss was not a possibility. It was a certainty waiting its turn. Acting became his refuge. On stage, he could inhabit emotion without consequence. He could feel deeply, intensely, and then step away. Real life did not offer that exit. Commitment to him felt like surrender, not to love, but to vulnerability. He once admitted that relationships frightened him more than failure ever did. They demanded something he had never learned how to give safely. So when Diane and Al found each other, it was not balance. It was collision. Diane's need for emotional anchoring met Pacino's instinct to remain unbound. She interpreted distance as something to work through. He experienced closeness as something that threatened his sense of self. Neither of them was wrong, but they were mismatched in ways that love alone could not correct. At first, this difference felt manageable, even magnetic. Diane believed patience could close the gap. Pacino believed time would soften expectations. Neither realized that time would only deepen the divide until wanting more and fearing more became the same breaking point. Loving someone who never learned how to stay. As the years passed, their relationship never settled into a clear shape. It did not end, but it also never fully arrived. Instead, it moved in cycles, together, apart, close, distant, repeating with a familiarity that slowly exhausted Diane and quietly comforted Pacino. For Diane, the passage of time carried meaning. Each year felt like proof that the relationship mattered, that endurance itself was a form of commitment. She believed that longevity would eventually turn into certainty. She waited not because she was naive, but because she trusted emotional continuity. To her, staying was an act of faith. For Pacino, time meant something else entirely. Time meant survival without confrontation. As long as nothing was forced, nothing had to be decided. He could love Diane deeply while still avoiding the one thing she needed most: permanence. He did not see this as cruelty. In his mind, he was protecting both of them from disappointment, from expectations he feared he could never fulfill. Their bond continued quietly while the world assumed it had already ended. Diane dated others, so did Pacino. But those relationships passed through their lives without leaving lasting marks. Diane herself later admitted that no one else ever displaced him emotionally. Others came and went. Pacino remained, sometimes present, sometimes distant, but never truly gone. What made this period especially painful was its invisibility. There were no public fights, no scandals, no dramatic endings, just years of emotional ambiguity. Diane did not demand loudly. She did not issue ultimatums early. She hoped understanding would grow naturally. She believed love, given enough space, would choose to stay. Pacino, meanwhile, remained emotionally evasive even when he was physically close. He could be attentive, affectionate, intensely present, and then unreachable without explanation. This pattern was not accidental. It was learned. He had grown up watching people disappear. Leaving first felt safer than being left. Friends noticed the imbalance long before Diane named it. She carried the emotional weight. She remembered dates, conversations, promises. He lived in the moment, then moved on from it. What Diane experienced as emotional labor, Pacino experienced as pressure. Still, she stayed. Not because she lacked options, but because she believed in meaning. She believed that if two people kept returning to each other, there had to be a reason. What she did not realize, until much later, was that returning and staying are not the same act. By the late 1980s, the cost of waiting had become undeniable. Diane was no longer willing to live inside possibility alone. She had given years. She had given patience. And now, she needed an answer. Not eventually, not someday, but now. That moment would arrive far from home, in a place heavy with memory, where silence would finally say what words never had. Rome. Silence and the moment, everything ended. By the time they arrived in Rome, both of them understood that something had to change. They were no longer young actors navigating uncertainty. They were established, respected, and burdened by the weight of unfinished history. The film they were working on carried its own legacy, but for Diane, this moment felt personal in a way nothing before had. They stayed in the same villa during production. Old rhythms returned easily. Shared meals, familiar laughter, quiet companionship that felt untouched by time. For outsiders, it looked like reconciliation. For Diane, it felt like clarity approaching at last. She had waited years without demanding answers. Now she needed one. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no raised voice, no anger. Diane spoke plainly. She did not accuse, she did not beg. She asked for truth. Marry me or let me go. It was not a test. It was a boundary. Pacino did not respond with words. He did not argue or explain. He simply withdrew. He chose silence, the same silence he had relied on throughout his life when emotions became too dangerous to face directly. That silence was the answer. For Diane, the absence of response was more devastating than rejection. Silence leaves no room for negotiation. It does not soften with time. It closes the door completely. Years later, she would admit that this moment broke something fundamental inside her. Not because she lost him, but because she finally understood that waiting longer would change nothing. At the same time, her personal life was unraveling. Her father was terminally ill. Grief arrived from two directions at once: the loss of a parent and the loss of a future she had quietly imagined for decades. She entered therapy not to heal from heartbreak alone, but to confront a pattern, loving someone deeply while accepting less than she needed. She later reflected that she had asked for more love than Pacino was capable of giving. Not because he lacked feeling, but because he lacked safety and commitment. I wanted him to love me the way I loved him, she said, but he couldn't. That realization carried both pain and clarity. After Rome, the relationship ended definitively. There were no public announcements, no closure interviews. They did not reconcile again. Diane stopped waiting. Pacino continued living as he always had, free, elusive, unanchored. But endings like this do not disappear cleanly. They leave residue. And though the romance was over, the emotional imprint remained, quietly shaping everything that came next, choosing solitude, choosing freedom. After Rome, Diane Keaton made a decision that surprised many people who thought they understood her. She did not replace Pacino. She did not search publicly for another great love. Instead, she turned inward. Therapy was not a phase for her. It became a turning point. She began to see clearly that what she had endured was not romantic patience, but prolonged emotional imbalance. In her 50s, Diane chose motherhood on her own terms. She adopted 2 children and built a life structured around presence rather than possibility. It was not a consolation prize. It was a conscious redirection. She once explained that she did not regret not marrying because forcing permanence with the wrong partner would have cost her peace. Stability, she learned, did not have to come from romance. Her career continued to flourish, but it no longer defined her worth. Awards came. Respect followed. Yet behind every success was a quiet acceptance that the love she wanted most would never arrive in the form she had hoped for. Solitude became something she embraced, not endured. Pacino's life took a different shape. He never married. He formed relationships, became a father multiple times, and remained emotionally elusive. Those closest to him said he avoided doors that felt irreversible. He valued freedom not as indulgence, but as survival. Even as he aged, that instinct never softened. What was most striking was their silence. Despite living near each other, they did not stay in contact. When asked why, Pacino reportedly said there was no need. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. It was not bitterness, it was finality. And yet the affection never disappeared. The words that came too late. Years passed. Lives unfolded separately, but memory does not obey distance. When Diane was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award, Pacino stood before an audience and spoke not as a colleague, but as someone returning to a place he had never truly left. He spoke of her artistry, her presence, her impact. And then, quietly, he said the words Diane had once needed to hear when they still had a future. "I love you forever." She did not cry. Perhaps because the grief had already lived its full life inside her. Or perhaps because love, once accepted without expectation, no longer demands response. When Diane later broke her silence, she did not frame her story as tragedy. She framed it as truth. She acknowledged that she had loved deeply, waited honestly, and eventually chosen herself. There was no bitterness in her voice, only clarity. She did not portray Pacino as cruel. She portrayed him as afraid. After her death, Pacino spoke again, this time without restraint. He described being shaken. He described memories returning with force, painful and moving at once. He called her his partner, his friend, someone who influenced the direction of his life. And he ended with a line that echoed across decades of unfinished emotion. She could fly, and in his heart, she always would. In the end, their story was never about a failed romance. It was about timing, fear, and the cost of waiting for someone who cannot meet you where you stand. Diane chose peace over longing. Pacino chose freedom over risk. And only one of them spent years in therapy mourning a future that never arrived. Some loves don't end with goodbye. They end with understanding, long after the moment has passed. Do you believe some people come into our lives to stay, or to teach us something we can only learn by letting go? If this story moved you, share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more untold Hollywood stories that still echo long after the curtain falls.